Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. The first church that I started to attend regularly was a little Mission Methodist church in Hayward, California. Had about 25 average attendance, a choir of 6. It was a wonderful little church. But over the years, I have managed to either attend or work at churches of a variety of denominations. Worked at Presbyterian Church, Lutheran Church, United Church of Christ, as well as some other Methodist churches. All of those churches, those denominations, you might call mainline Protestant denominations, right? They're kind of the big, or some of the big mainline Protestant denominations. And now that was back in 1976 when I first started attending that church and working at that church in Hayward. And the interesting thing is that over the intervening lot of years, the word salvation did not come up that often. It came up occasionally, but preaching about salvation or some focus on salvation did not seem to be a real focus in most of these churches. And that's different, I guess you would say. And I'm not quite sure why that topic was being avoided. There's been a lot of emphasis in mainline Protestant churches on things of this world, social justice and so on, and that's fine. But why aren't we really talking about salvation or not talking about it very much? Now, our non-denominational friends at those churches, I suspect they talk about salvation a little bit more than the main lines do. But why is that? What is the rationale behind that? And I don't know that I really have an answer, a complete one-sentence answer to that question, but it may be that the topic of salvation became rather complicated. There seemed to be all these different ways to look at it and all these different rules that might be applied to who would be saved and who would not be saved. And that kind of complication might make it easy for pastors to avoid the subject altogether. But we're going to try and tackle that this morning. Because the truth of the matter is, I rarely preach on salvation. It's not something you've heard from me very much. But we need to talk about it, particularly as we're coming now to the end of our Biblical Worldview sermon series. We'll have one more next week, and that'll be that. But the Bible is full of ideas and discussions of salvation. Jesus begins so many of his parables with, and the kingdom will be like. He's talking about what it means when you move on to heaven, when you are saved from the consequences of sin and death and have eternal life. It seemed to be important to Jesus. But really, to tell you the truth, it didn't seem all that complicated either. I mean, what does Paul say to the jailer? What is said to the jailer is, believe in Jesus and you'll be saved. What does Jesus say to the thief on the cross? Believe in me and I will see you in heaven. Right? And even all the way back in the Old Testament, the opening prayer that we had from Isaiah, where it just begins, the Lord is my salvation. That's really not that complicated, right? Believe in Jesus. But for some reason, I think because we're humans and we're curious about that, and that just seems way too easy, a lot of these complications have grown up and questions associated with them, like some of these. I made a list. I have a little list. So one big question is, once you have attained salvation, which is often called justification in sort of theological terms, can you lose it after that? Once you've gained salvation, can you lose your salvation? Martin Luther developed the idea called sola gratia. That means by grace alone. We heard that from Ephesians, the reading from Ephesians this morning. By grace you will be saved. So is salvation granted exclusively by Jesus, and that you have no say in the matter? It's only the grace of Christ by which you are saved. Another one, I think we've dealt with this one before, but it's one that comes up a lot. Can salvation be earned through works? In other words, is there a point system, right? If I rack up all these points, I'm saved. Here's one. Is the saving grace of Christ mitigated by the church? This has been a topic of discussion, particularly with Catholics who have lots of doctrines about that. Or is there an elect? Paul uses the word elect in a couple of passages, one famous one from Romans. Are there people who are elected to be saved, predestined to be saved? And one that can be difficult for us to wrestle with, can non-Christians be saved? Well, what do you think? Should we dive deep into each one of those questions? Talk about complications. I think maybe I want to throw out at you 3 metaphors for salvation. 3 ways in which we might look at how people have looked at salvation over history, over time, and then maybe we can work on some of those questions. The first one, I want you to imagine, what do they call it, a life ring? You know, that thing you throw to somebody who's drowning and it's attached to a rope and they pull you in. Well, imagine that life ring of salvation is attached to you at birth. All right? You cannot unattach yourself from that life ring, okay? You can't let go no matter what, and Jesus will eventually reel you in from the stormy seas in which you are trapped. This is typically the idea of predestination, that God knew at the beginning of time who would be saved, and ergo, they are saved. They get the life ring when they're born, okay? So one of the issues people have had with this, there's really no grace involved with that. I mean, grace tends to give us the idea of forgiveness and an active approach to salvation. But it also removes personal responsibility about salvation. I mean, that's really kind of the whole point of predestination. You have nothing to do with it at all. Now, here's a different one. So, Jesus, again, throws you the life ring. Jesus is standing on the shore of heaven and throws you the life ring as you are tossed about in the stormy waves of life. And you, us, we can choose to grab that life ring or not. We can choose to grab it or not. But once you do grab on, you are permanently attached. All right? So in essence, you get one choice, to grab the life ring or not. After that, you cannot lose your salvation. You are permanently attached, and Jesus is going to reel you in. That one does include the concept of perpetual grace, right? Because Jesus is throwing you the life ring and he's reeling you in. There's that grace that's permanent. But your personal responsibility is a little bit limited, right? You made that one, hopefully correct, choice to grab the life ring, but you can't choose to let go again. The third one, again, Jesus throws you the life ring as you are tossed about on the stormy seas of life. You can choose to grab it or not grab it. If you do grab it, you need to hold on while you're being reeled in, right? Your grip might slip sometimes. There might be moments of, oh my gosh, and you can choose to let go altogether. Just give up on Jesus, on God, let go of the life ring, and take your chances on the stormy seas. In this scenario, if you let go, Jesus will throw you the life ring again. That's kind of the cool thing about this scenario, right? Jesus will never abandon you. And that's really true in all 3 of these scenarios. Jesus isn't going to abandon you. But in this scenario, you have some responsibility to grab a hold of that life ring and to keep a hold of that life ring. So in here again, we have the perpetual grace of Christ. He's going to throw you that ring over and over and over again if he needs to. Okay? But you have free will. You have personal responsibility. You can reject the life ring or grab on. I clearly am in that last camp, the third scenario. I have real problems with predestination. Why create free will and then deny it? And there was a big battle in the church in the late 400s. Ooh, the late 400s. You remember the late 400s, right? There's a big battle in the Catholic Church about this between Augustine, you probably have heard of St. Augustine, and a Celtic monk named Pelagius. Some of you may have heard of Pelagius. But for Pelagius, again, this idea of salvation was pretty simple, pretty much like the third one that I outlined. Jesus throws you the life ring, you can choose to grab on or not. Augustine said, no. You are predestined. Augustine was kind of the originator of this idea of predestination, which is not what people in the early church really believed. Augustine was kind of going out on a limb with this idea of predestination. But God knew at the beginning of time whether you were going to say yes to God or not, so you have effectively said yes to God, whether you actually said yes to God or not, because you were predestined to be saved. And there was a huge battle about this, and it went to ecclesial courts, right? And Augustine dragged Pelagius into court in Jerusalem twice, these religious courts. And the religious courts both times ruled in favor of Pelagius. The idea of free will is the idea of free will. You can choose or not. So St. Augustine, who honestly wrote some of the greatest literature of Christian confession out there, nevertheless had this other side to him, and he waited till the current pope in Rome died, and then went to the new pope and sort of bribed him to condemn Pelagius. And not all, but the vast majority of Pelagius' writings were destroyed by the Roman Church because church politics, man. But that doesn't mean that these Pelagian ideas of free will just died out. Pelagius couldn't have cared less. He didn't really recognize the authority of the Bishop of Rome, and he went back to Ireland. Right? Okay, I'm a Celtic monk. I'm going to go back to Ireland and do my thing. And he was a venerated monk in Ireland. Here's a little bit of history. I know you're saying, oh no, here he goes again. There was a time when, as the Roman Empire was failing, the evangelical push of the Catholic Church kind of came to an end. And so Northern Europe, Denmark, the Netherlands, what we now call that, France, Germany, were left to be heathen lands, if you want to use that term, right? They were non-Christian. And it was the Irish monks who came around from the top. St. Aidan and some others traveled to Northern Europe and did the evangelizing that way. So actually, if you are of Northern European descent, you owe a lot to these Celtic monks who evangelized that part of the world. Anyway, back to salvation. It's so easy to get off track. As I said, the biblical narrative seems to make it simple. Believe in Jesus. So we have the famous story of the thief on the cross, right? You might recall from the Gospels that Christ is on the cross. He himself is going to die imminently. And there are two thieves beside him, one on either side. And one on this side is just telling Jesus he's full of it, right? This is just baloney. And this guy says, Lord, I believe. And Jesus says, then I will be with you in heaven. So this fellow over here, this thief on the cross, he doesn't have time left to really hang on to the life ring, right? Jesus throws it to him, he accepts it, and then he dies. And that is great. That's perfect. That's wonderful. This idea of last-minute salvation, last-second salvation is beautiful. And we remember this from another Bible story. You may remember the vineyard owner who hires a guy to work the vineyards or work the fields. I can't remember if it's a vineyard or not, but work the fields in the morning, and that guy works all day. And then, because there's so much work, at noon, the owner hires a second guy, and he works from noon to the end of the day. And things are still getting behind, so at the very end of the day, the last hour as it were, he hires a third guy. And the third guy works till the end of the day. But at the end of the day, the owner pays all three of them the same amount of money. Now, if we were talking about fairness, that seems grossly unfair. But it also implies, if the payment is salvation, that if you work harder and more hours, you will be saved. Salvation and fairness really don't have anything to do with each other. They're not compatible concepts because, again, fairness says, well, this guy worked 8 hours, so he should get more salvation than the guy who worked 4 hours. No, it is that act, first of all, of truly believing in your heart, the transformational act in your heart of believing that Jesus is the Son of God and that his redeeming work on the cross isn't abstract. It actually means something for you and me. However, not all of us are going to die on the cross. That's good news, in case you were wondering about that. So what do we do in between? Many of you, many of us, accepted Christ in our hearts years ago. And there may be folks here today who are still wondering about that. That's okay. But what are we doing in the meantime? So I kind of appended this, and forgive me, Lord, I probably should not append the Bible, but for salvation, believe in Jesus. Accept Jesus in your heart, that justification, as we call it. And if you continue to live, unlike the thief on the cross, act like you believe in Jesus. Do the things according to the way Jesus would want things to be done. All right? And this is what I mean by hanging on to that life ring. As Jesus is reeling you in, hang on. Hang on. Because the seas of life are stormy. There isn't a single person sitting out here today who has not experienced being tossed about, whether it's a time when you were out of money or when a loved one died or you suffered a personal tragedy or your house burned down or whatever it is. Those seas toss us about. And again, from our reading from the Bible today, hanging on to that life ring, sometimes clinging to that life ring as if it's the last thing that we have, because honestly it might be, allows you to build your house on solid rock. On solid rock I stand, not on sinking sand. That's what the life ring is. We talk about all sorts of things in church, and we should talk about all sorts of things in church. But we should talk about what salvation really means, what it really is. And I encourage you to not get sidetracked. I've gotten sidetracked. Many people have gotten sidetracked on this issue of salvation. And maybe that is the issue. It's so simple, it's hard for us to believe that that's really all it takes. For some people, it's pretty hard to give your heart to Jesus. For some people, that takes time. They see the life ring floating over there and they go, man, I could probably do better on my own. So maybe that's the difficult part. But the grace of Christ is perpetual, always. It never ends. If the death on the cross and the resurrection mean anything, they mean the perpetual grace of Christ, that Christ will never give up. But there is a law, God's law of the universe, as firm as any law of physics, that grants us free will. We can, in fact, ignore that life ring. But the real question is, why would you? Why would you? Even if you're not sure what's at the end of the rope, really, honestly, it's got to be better than drowning in the seas of life. If you have not already done so, grab that ring and hang on for all you're worth. Because there's nothing better than the grace of Christ waiting for you at the end of that rope.